In the U.S., we're told you can be anything, doctor, lawyer, even president. But what did a dream job look like in the ancient world? Tonight on Calm Historian, we'll wander from Egyptian scribes' desks to Roman bathhouses and Greek theaters to see how people worked and why it mattered. Please comment your location and current local time, and if this gentle journey speaks to you, a like and a subscribe would be appreciated. What kind of job do you want when you grow up? In the United States, children answer with a litany of possibilities: doctor, lawyer, astronaut, president, as if the future were a wide field stretching to the horizon. That promise of boundless choice feels strange when you turn the clock back and imagine childhoods in the ancient world, where most lives began and often ended in a steady, unchanging rhythm. For the majority of people in antiquity, work was not a series of career moves, but a way of life, rooted in the soil. Picture dawn breaking over small plots of land, dew on the furrows, the lowing of oxen, a farmer's hands black with earth. Those hands learned weather like a neighbor. They read the seasons the way we read a clock. The harvest decided everything: what families ate, which festivals were celebrated, who would be secure through winter. So, farmer was less a job title than the axis of the community. It was quiet, necessary, and unforgiving. Then cities began to swell, and a different energy pulsed through their stones and alleys. In Greek and Roman times, towns grew into cities, trade widened its roots, and monuments and marketplaces rose where fields had once been. Walls enclosed a new density of people and professions, and the curious and ambitious were drawn away from plows to cobbles, leaving the rhythm of the field for the rhythms of the city. Walk into one of those cities, and you hear layers of purpose. Near the administrative heart, officials and clerks move with the slow efficiency of governance. Scribes bent over wax tablets, reed pens scratching out tax rolls and contracts, magistrates dispensing judgments, messengers running with decrees from office to forum. These roles gave structure to urban life. Public works planned, disputes settled, records kept, and being part of the administration could lift a family's standing, anchoring them in law and language. A few streets over, a different kind of theater unfolds. The entertainment world, playhouses, amphitheaters, public spectacles, creates its own economy of sound and spectacle. Actors warm their voices in courtyards, musicians tune lyres and pipes, craftsmen fashion masks and costumes that transform a citizen into a god or tragic hero. The roar of a crowd at a play, the collective gasp at a chariot race, the thunder of applause after a clever line. These are the currency of lives spent making and staging delight. For some, the stage is a ladder to fame. For others, it's a precarious livelihood held together by favors and patronage. At the heart of civic commerce is the forum, the city's social bloodstream. Stalls and shops sprawl beneath colonnades, where merchants hawk spices, bolts of cloth, pottery, and everyday tools. A shopkeeper here is part banker, part storyteller, bartering, extending credit, and knowing which neighbor will need a length of fabric before they do. Selling from a shaded stall places you at the center of daily life, where the scent of baking bread mixes with the metallic glint of coins and gossip, moves faster than any official dispatch. If you imagine something more brutal, city life also offered the arena. Gladiator schools trained men, and occasionally women, for combat in the amphitheater, where discipline, spectacle, and survival met. A manager of such a school oversaw training, maintained weapons and armor, and negotiated the grim prices of fame and blood. It was a profession stitched to risk and notoriety, where a single match could make a name or bury it beneath the roar of the crowd. So when a child in those days asked the same question, "What will I be when I grow up?" the answers came from a different map of possibilities. Some routes promised steady respect, others the thrilling uncertainty of public life. Whether you tilled the field at dawn, penned decrees in a cool office, sang under the open sky, sold wares from a shaded stall, or taught a would-be fighter to stand and strike, each occupation was woven into a larger tapestry of community, duty, and desire. The ancient world may not have offered infinite choice, but it offered a rich, textured life for anyone willing to claim a place within its crowded streets. There was one calling the state could demand of you that stood apart from any other, one that would pull you away from your fields and family, carry you through winters and wars, and change the shape of your life. To be a soldier of Rome was to enter a world where sweat, iron, and discipline bound you to something larger than yourself. In the old days of the Republic, that world was not quite professional. It was a duty tied to the soil. Only those who owned enough land were expected to take up arms. When the trumpet sounded, neighbors and farmers became fighters, defending the city, and then, when the danger passed, turning back to plow and harvest. Empire, however, reshaped that obligation into a profession. The citizen soldier gave way to a standing army, men trained, drilled, and paid, who chose soldiering as a way of life rather than a temporary duty. The change altered the face of Rome's power. In camp, discipline was law. In the field, it was survival. The drills, the routines, the shared hardships formed men who moved and fought as one, a trained machine of muscle and steel. Picture the centurion, a presence among men, more than a rank, a symbol of order and command. Weathered by campaigns, his eyes sharp, he sets the tempo of the legion. Around him, the legionary moves with a practiced economy, not the panicked flail of a man fighting for his life for the first time, but the precise choreography of a blade honed by repetition. These legionaries were the backbone of Rome's might, the ones who carried the empire on their shoulders and in their packs. Their tools were part of them as much as courage. The pilum sailed from a line of men like a single, deadly thought, meant to shatter shields and unravel formations. Close at hand, the gladius, short, efficient, lethal at close quarters, became an extension of the arm. The scutum, that broad curved shield, took and scattered blows, forming a mobile wall when men pressed shoulder to shoulder. The helmet, rounded and flared against the sun, cradled the head. The lorica segmentata, layered and flexible, clung to the torso like a second skin, protecting ribs and lungs while allowing the quick twists and lunges that decided battles. Each piece of iron and leather was a promise between man and state, between soldier and comrade. Come back whole or be carried. Enlistment was not for a campaign, but for a long road. A young man signed on for 25 years. For a quarter of a century, you marched and built camps, with the same methodical care you later used to strike an enemy down. You kept watch in bitter cold and burning heat. You dug fortifications and hauled supplies. You lost friends and learned the hard grammar of survival. Think how many seasons could pass in that time. How many Mediterranean suns glittered above you. how many strange skies you slept under. When the 25 years were paid in sweat and service, the state kept its side of the bargain. That reward often came as land. A parcel awaited. The standard deal of Rome. Service in exchange for a stake in its future. For some it would be nearby, soil they knew. For others it would be as foreign as the campaigns they had endured. Maybe the plot lay among the ochre hills of Mauritania, where the air tastes of distant storms and the earth remembers another sun. Perhaps the land was in Syria, where heat shimmers on stone and ancient olive trees shade old trade routes. Or it could be in Britannia, where harsh winds and dark soil meet a sea that seems to come from another world, and winters leave a hard rim on the fields. To hold that parcel was to be bound again to the earth, to put down roots, sow, and claim a place in the empire's vast, uneven quilt. For those who were not citizens when they took the oath, the army offered another transformation. After long service, the state would grant citizenship, a remarkable change. From outsider to member of the polity, with rights that shaped status and family for generations. It was a tangible reward for danger borne, a gift that could echo through the lives of children and grandchildren. Even in retirement, Rome's grasp could remain. Veterans might be called upon again, summoned to serve on the empire's restless frontiers. The line between cities and miles, between field and fortress, could blur once more. You had paid your debt, but the needs of the empire sometimes reached beyond a single term of service, and the man who had marched could be asked to pick up his kit again, moving with the economy of someone used to packing at a moment's notice. Imagine a veteran standing at the edge of his small field, hands roughened by both sword and plow, eyes carrying the memory of long roads. He remembers marching in step, the clangor of armor, the smell of pitched fires, and the quiet grief when comrades did not return. But he also knows the taste of freshly turned soil and the peace of borders that hold. He has paid a price and received his due. Land, perhaps citizenship, a place to call his own. And though the empire might call him back, for a while he can stand and breathe, rooted on the patch of earth that is his, a living testament to what it cost to keep Rome both fed and feared. You push back the flap, and the world changes. The air inside the reconstructed tent is warmer, quieter by degrees, carrying the close, smoky scent of hides and a small hearth. Not the bright, fresh smell of fields, but the lived-worked smell of something made to move. The walls around you are not canvas but goat hides, stitched and stretched until they hold a shape that can be packed, picked up, and carried in a single breath. When the wind pushes against them, the tent flexes like the skin of some living thing. When the sun finds a seam, it throws a thin, honeyed light across everything. Against one wall, a small wooden chest sits like a private island. Its planks have the grain and slight unevenness of hand-cut timber, its iron bands darkened by many hands. It is where a man locks away the handful of things that make him more than a soldier. A scrap of writing, a keepsake, a small tool, the tokens you would not risk losing to a march. You can imagine the lid creaking when it opens, the brief pause you take while handling what's inside, the small return to yourself that those objects bring. The bed is no more than a narrow pallet, a place to lie down rather than to linger. It is the kind of bed you fold into and fold away, designed for sleep that must be swift and for unceremonious waking. Still, within that tight space, there are tiny comforts. The lie of a blanket, the familiar weight that gathers around bones tired from a day's marching. In the brief darkness before dawn, thoughts gather and scatter, memories of home, the hard business of the next day, the quiet measures of fear and resolve. On another wall a little shrine claims its corner. It might be no more than a bowl, a carved image, a painted token, or an arrangement of objects that make sense only to the person who placed them there. Who or what is honored depends entirely on the individual. A choice of gods, spirits, ancestors, private practices carried alongside armor and rations. Stepping inside the tent, you enter a space where the personal and the sacred meet, and ritual becomes a way to mark presence in a place otherwise defined by transience. The tent is a private, isolated world made out of necessity. When the group moves, the tent moves with them. When a camp is struck, the interior life is packed and borne along. Yet even on the march and in the din of battle, this little enclosure offers a rare pause. You can sit, you can breathe, you can collect your thoughts, you can speak a name, lay down an offering, count the day's losses or the day's small mercies. The gods, whatever form they take in that narrow shrine, are ever present, a constant thread in a life defined by change. That constant readiness, the way everything must fold up and be carried, is part of why a military career was not for everyone. The tent is practical, yes, but it is also a reminder, a world of movement, a stripped-down intimacy that must always be packed away. For some, the lodge and the field, the fixed roof and the steady soil, called more strongly. For others, the tent offered the rigors and the sacred solitude they sought. Step inside, and you see how people tried to make a private, human world on the go. Small sanctuaries stitched from hides and faith, steadiness pared down to essentials, a little interior life kept safe amid the march. Most people here are not pious in any solemn, reverent way. Their minds are full of the day's accounts, the tallying of animals, the weighing of hides, the sharp arithmetic of gain and loss. If you wanted to learn the art of doing business in the city, you would not go to a school or a lecture hall. You would come to the place where commerce breathes most visibly. So come with me now to the Forum Boreum, the ancient cattle market, where fortunes are made or lost beneath the same sky that watches priests and heroes. The market itself is a study in sound and scent, close enough to the Tiber that river light skitters across the paving stones. It hums with life, the lowing of cattle, mixing with the clank of harness and the exasperated bargaining of men who have spent the morning hauling beasts from the countryside. The air holds the iron tang of river water, the sour bite of hay and dung, and the sweet faint smell of hides drying. Voices rise and fall, merchants calling prices, buyers calling back, while the scratch of styluses on wax tablets records deals. Dust is raised by hooves and sandals, and everywhere there is a small, constant glitter, coins, counters, and the keen glances of those who measure value in more than words. All this rough commerce sits under the watch of older things. Tradition says Hercules once passed these very stalls along the riverbank. That memory hangs over the place like a promise of strength and protection. To honor him, several temples rose here, and one of them, a temple of marble, poised at the Tiber's edge, still keeps its quiet vigils. Its stone faces catch sunlight as if they could whisper back to the river. It is a mute, patient witness to centuries of trade, piety, and the ordinary drama of daily life. Tucked into the curve of an old street, not far from that temple, stands a small marble arch. It is diminutive beside Rome's great triumphal arches, but elegant and composed, more doorway to memory than gateway to power. Formerly it honors the Emperor Septimius Severus and his family, his wife and children, a public tribute set in stone. But when you read the letters closely, the scene becomes more revealing. The inscription names who actually paid for the work. The Argentarii and the Negociantes, the moneylenders and the merchants, laid down the funds. Their names, carved into the arch, are in effect the architects of this civic gesture. Look at the stones. Rain and wind have softened the edges of the letters, yet the phrase remains legible, deliberate. Those who handled money, who kept ledgers and counted out coins and moved goods up and down the river, wanted that trace to endure. Their generosity turns a private compliment to an emperor into a public artifact. They were not content with the private profit of a good season. They wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to mark the city with evidence that commerce had a hand in making Rome what it was. It is easy to imagine their footsteps there. Perhaps they paused in the shade of the temple to confer before committing the funds. Perhaps they met in a noisy shop where the clink of coins sounded like good news. The little arch is their signature, its graceful lines, the play of shadow across its cornices, the way it frames a sliver of river view. Those are the touches people with means and a sense of legacy would commission. The neat, restrained claim made in marble rather than boastful bronze. The whole site speaks of a delicate balance, the raw, sometimes raw-boned business of the market rubbing shoulders with the quiet dignity of temples and monuments. The roughness of trade is softened by worked stone. The pragmatic and the sacred brush shoulders. Public spaces here were shaped not only by emperors and generals, but by the men who counted the coins and ferried the goods. By building an arch to honor the imperial family, the Argentarii and Negociantes linked their daily, gritty labor to the grandeur of official Rome and placed themselves squarely in the city's story. As you walk away from the arch and the temple toward the river, the market keeps its rhythm, bargaining and coins sliding across palms, contracts sealed, and ledgers updated. But the image of that small marble arch stays with you, an assertion that money and trade were visible forces in public life, powerful enough to fashion stone and register ambition. The marble of the temple and the carefully executed arch together remind us that Rome was built by many hands, some holding spear and scepter, others holding balance scales and writing tablets, and that each, in its own way, left a mark on the city that we can still read today. Close your eyes for a moment and step into a cool, low-ceilinged room where color still clings to plaster, and the faint ghost of a brushstroke seems to follow your hand. On the wall, frescoes show two women, not as ornaments, but as makers, brushes balanced between their fingers, a palette smudged across a thumb. Those painted figures feel intimate, windows into lives spent shaping the world with slow, steady gestures. They remind us that creativity in the ancient city belonged to a broad community of practiced hands, not just a handful of famous names. A little farther on, near a narrow window, the stubborn residues of pigment uncovered at Pompeii catch the light, filmy layers of color, tiny flakes like secret messages. They speak quietly but insistently about choices, about which hue would best warm a face in the marketplace, or how a patterned band might dignify a doorway. Picture a painter in a shaded workshop, grinding ochre and charcoal on a stone slab, fingers stained by work. There were no machines to insulate maker from material. Every color was mixed, stored, and applied with care born of long experience. How did someone become this kind of maker? There were no diplomas pinned to walls. Training happened in the workshop, lived day by day. Young people arrived as apprentices, sweeping floors, carrying water, passing along the chisel. In time, those small chores became lessons. A mason's helper learning the language of stone by touch, sensing how hard a chisel should bite a brittle flint or gentle limestone. In the glass house, apprentices stood at the furnace's edge for hours, learning how molten glass hangs from a rod and how a breath can coax shape from heat. Skill grew through repetition, observation, and the steady application of patience. Apprenticeship was more than technique. It was a way of seeing. The novice absorbed the rhythm of the workshop, the metronomic tap of chisel on anvil, the low sigh of bellows feeding a kiln, the sharp crackle as glaze reached its moment. They learned to read materials. One nick could ruin a piece. The right pressure could reveal a form. Those neat brick walls that still stand are not the work of a single master, but the product of generations taught hand to hand. Each even course a lesson passed forward, every confident line thus patient proof of long practice. Compare that world to our own, where most objects arrive smooth and uniform from invisible machines. Ancient tools had weight, grain, temperature, history. Terracotta vessels still carry the warmth of the potter's palms. Bronze tools seem to hum with the memory of the hammer. Glass catches light and keeps the echo of the maker's breath. Bone and ivory, shaved thin and polished, show the accuracy of a practiced eye. Every object bore the fingerprint of touch. Imagine a comb held up to the sun, its teeth worn, its surface burnished by decades of handling, carved from bone so the edges would slide through hair without snagging. Picture a pan over coals, its bronze dulled by use, or a ceramic pot glazed deep brown from 1,000 meals. For those with wealth, silverware flashed and chimed at table, signaling status as much as serving food. Each material named a trade: terracotta specialists, bronze casters, glassmakers who knew flame and draft, silversmiths who understood temper, carvers who brought life out of bone and ivory. Those materials shaped livelihoods. A city hummed because every object demanded a maker. The patina on a bronze mirror, the slight warp of a hand-thrown pot, the delicate filigree on a silver cup. Each revealed a craftsman's judgment. There was pride in finish and a love of proportion. Much of what we might call utility crossed into art. Year after year, trained hands produced objects that were useful and durable, but also often profoundly beautiful, speaking centuries later of taste, skill, and daily life. The workshop had a social texture, too. Apprentices learned to accept correction, to read a master's gesture, a wagged finger, a lifted eyebrow, as easily as a teacher reads a student's notes. There was camaraderie in shared labor and frustration when a pane of glass cracked or a glaze ran. Alongside setbacks were small, bright triumphs. The first cup that sat perfectly on its foot, the day a stone finally took a true polish. Those moments turned helpers into artisans and built the quiet confidence visible in a Roman wall or a painted portrait. Walk through such a place in your imagination. Hear the scrape of sand and the rhythmic tapping as someone tests a bowl's thinness. Smell the metallic tang near a bench where bronze is buffed and the faint sweetness of drying glue where pigments are bound. See a woman painter, calm and unhurried, moving her hand with the economy of someone who knows exactly how much color a face needs and when to stop. Catch the flicker off a newly turned piece of silver, a little miracle of skill. Craft was not a backwater of society, but woven into its fabric. Household objects, from clay spoons to fine silver, testified to the skill and dedication of a vast artisan class. Knowledge passed eye to eye, hand to hand, across months, years, even decades. The result was an enormous catalogue of work. Functional, durable, and often beautiful. So next time you see a fresco of a woman with a brush or notice a faded smear of pigment from Pompeii, remember the people behind the image. Think of training learned on the job, of materials that demanded intimate knowledge, of ashes in a furnace and the steady breath of a glass blower, of clay sliding across a wheel, and of the quiet satisfaction when a form is born under a guiding hand. Their world was built not by machines, but by patient, countless hands, artisans who understood their materials and transformed them into objects that still speak to us across time. When you picture the public baths of the ancient world, it's easy to see marble pools, the steady hiss of water, and people drifting from warm rooms to cold plunges with relaxed conversation. What usually disappears from that picture is the human machinery that had to hum and groan behind the scenes to make those rituals possible. Walk with me away from the mosaic halls and into the narrow, shadowed corners where work took the place of leisure. At the edge of the bathing complex, you would find specialists who dealt in what we now think of as densely private services. In a curtained alcove, a plucker sat close to a patron, fingers or tweezers poised to pull hair from armpits. The procedure was intimate and awkward. People braced themselves, sometimes crying out when a sudden sharp tug surprised the skin. Those quick yelps ricocheted down tiled corridors, startling in a place otherwise filled with the calm drip of water. For the workers it was routine, but never gentle. You could almost feel the tension in the muscles and the brief relief when the pain passed. Elsewhere in the baths, other hands kept everything running. Attendants watched the plumbing, making sure water flowed, emptying and refilling basins, tending channels, so waste did not back up. They descended into the less pleasant parts of the complex, working where sewers and drains met, and clogging could throw the whole place into messy disarray. It wasn't glamorous work. It demanded knowledge of the system's rhythms and a willingness to deal with what others preferred not to see. Beneath the dressed floors and heated rooms were the furnace tenders, the men who fed and managed fires that warmed the baths from below. The warm chambers were not heated by an invisible furnace, but by embers and flames in cramped hypocausts. These workers stooped in low ceilings, bent over coals and ash, the air thick with smoke and damp. Imagine the soot clinging to hair and clothes, the smell of wood smoke and sweat braided together, the constant physical strain of keeping the heat alive for the rooms above. And then there were the fullers, the remarkable, often maligned craftsmen who cleaned and finished clothing. In a society where public appearance was crucial, and the toga had to look immaculate, fullers ran the Fullonica, a place that was part factory, part workshop, part chemical lab. Clients brought stained togas and soiled tunics, expecting them returned white and respectable. What followed would surprise a modern nose. Fullers used substances that broke down grease and organic grime in ways primitive soap could not. Urine, prized for its ammonia, was a deliberate cleaning agent. It helped dissolve oils baked into fabric. Fuller's earth, a clay-like mineral, absorbed dirt and acted as an abrasive. To whiten garments they burned sulfur, whose fumes helped bleach the threads. The combined odors of ammonia, damp cloth, and smoldering sulfur stung the air and the eyes. The Fullonica was a place that assaulted the senses, even as it produced startling results. The work itself had a rhythm and a rough choreography. Clothes were soaked in tubs and amphorae, sometimes in a big communal basin, where men waded in and worked the textiles with their feet. You could picture them treading and shifting in time, water lapping around their knees as they bent and stomped, their movements kneading and flexing fibers so the cleaning agents could penetrate. It was almost a dance, except it was driven by labor, wet legs, damp clothes clinging to skin, and a steady pace set by the demands of customers and the stubbornness of stains. Many fullers were also dyers, offering a side business that could change or restore a garment's color. Dyeing required its own knowledge of materials and timing, so some workshops combined both trades, cleaning and recoloring, to meet a patron's wish for a fashionably bright tunic or a perfectly white toga. Inside the Fullonica, the environment was intense. Burning sulfur sent blue-tinged smoke curling through the room and settling on every surface. Hands were constantly in contact with caustic and staining materials. Eyes watered from fumes. Still, the payoff could be dramatic. A patron returned later to collect a toga as bright as snow, often unaware of the faint sulfur tang clinging to the threads or of the trudging, laboring feet that had restored its color. None of these jobs carried glamour. The plucker's work put strain on fingers and required acute attention. Plumbing attendants dealt daily with filth and the brutish physics of moving water. Furnace tenders endured heat, smoke, and crippling posture, and fullers weathered caustic chemicals and harsh smells. Patrons reclining in warm rooms saw only the polished surfaces. They rarely thought about the hands that plucked and scrubbed, the feet that danced the cloth, or the fires that kept the baths warm. There was a social layering to the whole enterprise, leisure above, labor below, a mingling of dignity and indignity that made public life possible. The bathing complex was an ecosystem of expertise, where specialized workers handled intimate, unpleasant, and physically demanding jobs, so the city's public life could appear as pristine as the marble lining the pools. So the next time you imagine ancient baths, stay a moment with the hidden scenes, the sudden cry of a hair being pulled, the dull thud of feet in a soapy pool, the hiss of fire beneath the floors, the sharp tang of sulfur that clings to a newly whitened toga. These are not mere anecdotes, but the textures of daily life, the sounds, smells, and labors that kept cities running and gave the polished rituals of the day their shine. In the ancient world, the sea was not a distant line on the horizon, but a highway, a marketplace, and a stage for constant motion. Great cities grew where water met land. Alexandria with its light and learning, Athens with its marble voices, and Ostia with its mouths open to the Mediterranean and to the Tiber beyond. Wherever sailors could make the waves speak, people gathered, boats arrived and were built, Goods came and went, and whole livelihoods rose and fell with the tide. Picture Ostia at the river's mouth, not a quiet fishing village, but the living throat through which the empire breathed. Ships slid in with hulls darkened by salt and sun, each one carrying more than cargo, owners who had risked capital, captains who read wind and chart, crews who had kept ropes taut for weeks. This city, at the water's edge, was Rome's porter, a place where goods from distant provinces were touched, counted, repacked, and sent upriver to feed the capital's endless appetite. Behind that single function lay a braided world of skill and trade. Along the quays, shipwrights bent over timbers, planing and caulking, listening for the right pitch of a plank. Carpenters and caulkers worked with pitch and tar to seal seams against a merciless sea. Sailmakers stitched great squares of canvas, while rope walks stretched fibers into lines that would tether fortunes and lives. Repairmen and divers stood ready to mend torn sails or haul a leaky vessel ashore. The rasp of files, the thud of mallets, the smell of resin and hot tar became as familiar as the cry of gulls. When a vessel docked, a new choreography began. Crews and hired hands turned into porters, backs and bodies moving in an unspoken rhythm as amphorae, crates and sacks were slid, hoisted, and ferried from hold to shore. The quays thrummed with calling voices and shouted counts, with the clack of hooves as pack animals picked their way through narrow ways, and with the metallic ring of scales measuring weight and worth. Behind the bustle, the warehouses rose, cool, shadowed rooms where the sea's offerings were stored until they could be inventoried and sent onward. Those warehouses needed constant tending, overseers to keep accounts and record arrivals, laborers to stack and restack heavy goods, craftsmen to repair racks and doors, and guards to protect the wealth they held. Security was practical and everyday, locks tested, watchmen posted, and sometimes force brought in to keep pilferers and storms at bay. The work never felt abstract. It was physical, immediate, and essential to the life of the city. Ostia functioned more like a living mechanism than a set of buildings. Merchants argued over ledgers by lamplight, brokers negotiated passage and price, and local artisans turned imported raw materials into things the city needed, barrels made and mended, labels scribbled, taxes calculated. Every task had its expert. Men who knew exactly how to lash a crate, women who sorted coins and bills of lading, youths sent on urgent errands to the capital. Days blurred into one another with this steady flow. Seasons changed timetables, but the necessity of movement never did. One of the clearest echoes of that daily life survives in stone by the town theater. Excavators named a tucked-away corner the Piazza of the Corporations, an archaeologist's shorthand, because there were no modern corporations in antiquity, but the place speaks plainly of commerce. A porticoed square opens off the theater, and under its arches a long row of modest shops runs along the harbor. More than 50 small businesses once pressed their faces to the public square, and in many of them the floors hold mosaics, little pictorial signatures laid in stone. Stand in that colonnade and look down. You do not just see pattern, but purpose. A tiny ship, a set of oars, an amphora rendered in tesserae, the likeness of an animal or tool. Beside these images, inscriptions name the trade or the people who worked there. These are business cards in stone, public declarations of profession and connection that were meant to last. The names and pictures speak beyond local ties, echoing with ports across the Mediterranean, North African harbors, European markets, and towns towards the Middle East. They reveal not abstract routes, but real, repeated interactions between traders, fleets, and warehouses. From those mosaics we read a human testimony to diversity. Ostia was a mosaic in more than one sense, a meeting place of languages and customs, a handling point for many kinds of goods, a weave of livelihoods. The sight of amphorae stacked like sleeping soldiers, the roar of voices bargaining in different tongues, the smell of damp wood and oil, and the permanent silent testimony of the mosaics together bring the harbor to life. Each portico shop tells a story of contracts signed, of goods tallied and repacked, of the small tireless work that made an empire's appetite possible. So, when we say all roads led to Rome, imagine, too, that all ships led to Ostia. Here distance ended, and exchange began anew. Here the labor of many made the grandeur of one possible. The city's pulse was this rhythm of loading and unloading, of ledger and latch, of hands that toiled and inscriptions that remembered. In that harbor the breadth of the Roman world condensed into daily work, and the piazza of the corporations stands as a quiet, eloquent record of how the fates of distant towns and this busy river mouth were bound together. People came to the city as if drawn by a single, invisible current. Musicians followed the promise of an audience, their fingers and breath trained to fill stone courtyards and tiled roofs with sound. Teachers arrived because the city held minds eager to be shaped. Parents willing to pay for lessons that turn boys and girls into scribes, philosophers, and skilled tradesmen. Chefs came with knives and pots, ready to feed the multitudes and make their name with a single, perfect stew. Artisans appeared with hammers and needles, prepared to turn raw metal and woven thread into things both useful and admired. Architects were here, too, tempted by the chance to leave something permanent, a skyline to be read across generations, places where law was spoken, markets opened, and families gathered. You can almost hear the city breathe. There is the low murmur of bargaining at the market, the bright trill of a lyre from a shaded courtyard, the measured voice of a teacher dictating a lesson, the steady clatter of chisels where an apprentice repeats a master's movement for the 1,000th time. Work here is not abstract. It is tactile, a life of hands learning the weight of a blade, the give of a clay shoulder, the grain of timber that will become a beam. Each object shows its maker's touch. A seam stitched by a practiced palm, a bowl formed with a finger's memory, a facade smoothed after argument and calculation. The city offers more than livelihoods. It offers spectacle and taste, actors and musicians, stage evenings that make laughter and tears spill out into the streets. Painters and sculptors create images to hang in private homes and public squares, pieces to be admired, copied, or debated over wine. Tailors and weavers set up looms and dye pots, turning raw fiber into the daily garments that mark a person's station and taste. None of this stands alone. The food that fuels the labor, the grain that fills the baker's oven, the barrels of wine that lubricate conversation and commerce, arrive along the same arteries that knit the region together. Those arteries are roads and rivers, roots of necessity and storytelling alike. Oxen trains and cartwheels carve ruts that name future journeys. Riverboats push against currents with crews calling commands, and ships come in from across the Mediterranean, carrying not only goods, but news and new ideas. Grain is heaped at the granaries. The smell of fresh-cut straw and damp earth mixes with peat smoke from urban hearths. Wine rests in cool cellars, dark and heady, a welcome for travelers and a commodity for merchants. From the broad waterways to the narrow alleys, people and produce move in a steady, indispensable choreography. Walk through such a city, and you notice the ordinary and the extraordinary braided together. A tutor calling a child by name, the potter's wheel slowing while the maker studies a new crack, cooks exchanging recipes as they ladle broth, stonemasons arguing the angle of a cornice. Each day is a negotiation between craft and customer, between skill and survival. The city does more than employ people. It reshapes them, sharpening ambitions, dulling failures, making reputations and dissolving old ones. In that constant hum of work and traffic, you understand why so many risked the journey. Here, talent met demand, tools met materials, and along roads, rivers, and the Mediterranean, life's essentials and its finer pleasures flowed to meet them.